Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay, oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
Every Who down in Who-Newville liked the holidays a ton. But where to get great prices on gifts, they had no idea. None. They searched and they searched for great gifts under $25. Gifts for spouses and friends and even their toddlers. When suddenly one Who shouted, Walmart has what you want, knowing they have Lego, Tree Hut, and low prices to flaunt. So they enjoy the holiday season as Who's often do. Cheering and shouting, Walmart has incredible gifts. Who knew? Find gifts they'll love under $25 at Walmart.
Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. We are super excited and very happy to have the great David Montgomery joining us from the XVIII podcast once again. Hello, David.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. For those of you not familiar with David, one of the best French history podcasts in the world, the XVIII. And for the uninitiated, David, what is your podcast about?
So the XVIII is looking at sort of that overlooked century in French politics between the downfall of Napoleon in World War I. Obviously, Napoleon sticks around for a little bit, spectacularly in one case. But look, this part that doesn't get as much coverage, at least not from high politics reasons, and sort of going through in order, trying to understand and tell the stories of things like the Bourbon Restoration and the July Monarchy, where a lot of interesting things were happening that most people never know anything about from their history books. So it just seemed like a perfect gap in people's understanding that all the information was there, and it would just take a little bit of work to popularize it. How much you define a little bit has maybe changed since I first conceived this a few years ago.
Yeah, well, what I like about it is, my podcast obviously is focused on the Napoleonic era, kind of 1789 to 1815, and yours kind of picks up the story, but it also has a lot of recurring characters, cameo appearances by guys like Marshal Marmont and the guy we're talking about today, King Charles X, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these figures were active through much of this whole period. I mean, the whole revolutionary generation, Lafayette, Louis XVIII, Charles X, people who were active in 1789, and a lot of them were gone by 1830. But some were still around and were still playing really big roles. Lafayette and Charles X, bigger than any of them, yep. As well as Louis Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans.
Yeah, and we're going to dive into Charles X. That's our focus for today. Before I do that, though, I want to mention David has a great Patreon, a lot of bonus content, a lot of interesting stuff. If you want to support the XVIII on his Patreon, please go check that out. And, of course, the Generals and Napoleon Patreon.
Yeah, support John's Patreon as well.
That's right. So I want to start off with an episode I listened to recently of yours. It was an episode with Mike Duncan, the host of the Revolutions podcast. And it was really intriguing. It was a nice hook to get me to listen to it. So it says, basically, do you think Charles X might go down as, quote, one of the greatest idiots of history, end quote?
Yeah, that was Mike's great phrase. And I'm not sure if he's the single greatest idiot of history, but it's always bad when you can make a case that you should be included. Certainly there have been bigger idiots who've ruled. Ferdinand VII of Spain comes to mind, a big dum-dum. But Charles X, he might appreciate this somewhat, given that he was a big gambler. But he was playing with bigger stakes than most as the ruler of France, a big country, and through an ultimately entirely preventable self-inflicted wound, ended up losing his throne and losing his cause.
Yeah, for those unfamiliar, Charles X, that was his kingly name, but he was the successor of Napoleon's successor, Louis, correct?
Yeah, so Louis XVI, you might know, is the king of France during the French Revolution, married Marie Antoinette, was guillotined. Louis XVI had two younger brothers. The Comte de Provence, who later took the throne as Louis XVIII, was the middle brother. And the youngest brother, the Comte d'Artois, who we're talking about today, after Louis XVIII died without any children, Charles then took the throne as the third of the Bourbon brothers to rule France. He ruled from 1824 to 1830, after Louis XVIII had, claimed to rule for several decades, but actually ruled for most of 1814, most of 1815, and then all the way to 1824.
Right. For those who don't know, Louis XVIII claimed he was ruling from abroad while he was in exile, while Napoleon was running the show. But we'll get into all that. Okay, let's dive into the subject matter. Born in 1757 as Charles Philippe, Comte or Count d'Artois, he's the younger brother of both Louis XVI and Louis XVIII. What was his upbringing like?
Lavish. He grew up in Versailles. You know, the system that had been constructed by Louis XVI and by Louis XIV and refined by Louis XV as the most glamorous court in all of Europe. And one that hung on to that glamour, even as a lot of other courts were becoming more austere, more military in style in the 18th century. This was an era of elaborate court customs, elaborate court costumes, powdered wigs, all this stuff. And the Comte d'Artois grew up in this atmosphere. He was fantastically rich, something of a playboy, loved gambling and horses and hunting, fairly dissolute, one might say, enjoying all the pleasures of his position. He was, even as a young man, always on the right wing, even within Ancien Regime politics, which is saying something. He was always among the most conservative of this conservative regime.
Right. And I would say that's going to be both his greatest strength and fatal flaw. He's a staunch royalist and ultra-conservative even before the French Revolution happens. What does that mean exactly, and why did this conflict with the Jacobins on the other side?
So before the French Revolution, what that meant was that he was, generally speaking, an opponent of reform. In the latter decades of the Ancien Regime, there were also... France was in a rough state as a country. It was deeply in debt. Its revenues weren't meeting expenses. The system was sclerotic. It was impossible to get anything done. And there were these ideas that were coming out left and right. Well, if we do this, we can fix things. If we do that, we can fix things. And with every idea, there were people saying, oh, we can't do that. That would be too disruptive. That would undermine the power of the king. That would undermine the power of our ancient traditions. And pretty reliably, whenever there was a group of people saying we can't do that, the Comte d'Artois was one of that group, along with Marie Antoinette, who was also a leader of the conservative faction. The Comte de Provence, the future Louis XVIII, was relatively more progressive. He was, well, certainly no radical, sort of liked to dabble in reform projects and stuff like that. So even from this early age, there was this sort of political difference. And none of these were Democrats. They were all committed royalists. It was just a question of what's the best approach for this absolute monarchy to take.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, as you mentioned, he's kind of the youngest of the family. His brother, Louis XVI, has a son. So do you think he ever had an inkling that he might be king one day? Because he's pretty far down the list of succession, even after the French Revolution.
The odds that Charles would ever become king, especially before the French Revolution, were pretty low. But low in the sense of a royal family.
Right.
He was still just a couple steps away from the throne. They say that every cardinal imagines himself being pope and every senator imagines themselves being president. I have to imagine that every Bourbon imagined themselves becoming king, and Charles is probably no exception, even when he was fifth or sixth in the line of succession.
Yeah.
And of course, the Bourbons had for several generations had been very long-lived and had passed their throne from grandfather to grandson rather than father to son. So it was entirely possible, if that had continued, that Charles would have died before ever having the chance to become king. But on the other hand, Charles did have sons relatively early on. The middle brother, Louis XVIII, never had children. And especially after the French Revolution happened and Louis XVI was killed, and then Louis XVI's son, dubbed by royalists Louis XVII, died in fairly miserable captivity. At that point, it became fairly likely that Charles would become king. All he had to do was outlive his brother at that point. And if Charles didn't become king, then Charles' son was in line to become king.
Right. And for those who don't know, Louis XVIII was never the portrait of healthiness.
No, he was, even as a young man, he tended to being overweight, as opposed to Charles, who was always slim, elegant, eventually something of a silver fox. By the time Louis XVIII was king, he was massively overweight, was in a wheelchair from many of the last years of his life, suffered from gout that was so debilitating it sometimes prevented him from engaging in politics at fairly crucial times. Generally had, it was never in great health, and there was never any idea that Louis XVIII was going to live to be 90 or anything like that.
Yeah.
Whereas, Charles X was, as I said, much more active, physically, in much better health. So, at a certain point, he was the heir apparent to the throne, and it seemed fairly likely that he would get a chance to become king.
Let's talk about his family. In 1773, he gets married to Marie Theresa. How was their marriage, and did they have kids?
So their marriage was okay as far as aristocratic arranged marriages go. They managed to procreate, which is more than you can say for some of these couples. They had two sons, became the Duc d'Angoulême, who was something of a fail son, ultimately, not as bright as his father, fairly bumbling, and the Duc de Berry, who took after his father's youthful playboy ways and eventually partied and philandered his way across Europe, eventually left a string of illegitimate children, including, at the time of his death in 1820, stabbed by an assassin outside the Paris Opera. His wife and multiple mistresses were all pregnant at that time with posthumous children, which, was embarrassing, but also for a royal family that had not had a lot of children was at least a good sign that at least one of these guys was fertile.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the Duc de Berry's posthumous son, Henry, would become the heir of the Bourbon line, and would continue to make the Bourbon claim to the throne as late as the Third Republic.
Yeah, and Duc de Berry was stabbed, I believe, by a Bonapartist. So there's a lot of hatred, but you can see between Bonaparte's faction and the Bourbons. But we'll get into that in a minute. So the French Revolution happens. The future Charles X has to flee France and become a leader of the émigré opposition to the revolution. I mean, it must have been very upsetting. His one brother, the King Louis XVI, is guillotined, and he's basically in exile with his other brother, the future Louis XVIII. How close were these brothers?
Not especially close. Charles X, the Comte d'Artois, was essentially the first émigré. He left France the day after the Bastille fell. Widely reported that, he left because of his devotion to conservative politics, and he was discussed what was happening. Other historians suggest this might have been a "you can't fire me, I quit" situation, because Louis XVI was extremely annoyed that Artois, his younger brother, by being so flamboyantly reactionary, was stirring up opposition and trouble, and just wanted him off the scene. So whether he left entirely voluntarily or was pushed out, he left in 1789. Louis XVIII, the Comte de Provence, wouldn't leave France for several more years, leaving successfully at the same time as the famous flight to Varennes, when Louis XVI also tried to flee and was caught and captured and brought back. From exile, Artois just intrigued constantly, even against direct orders from Louis XVI to can it and stop doing that. He was convinced that he knew better than his brother what was in the best interest of the monarchy, and he pursued his idea of the best interest of the monarchy even against the implied and sometimes direct commands of the monarch himself. And he continued to do this after Louis XVI died and Louis XVIII was the head of the family. Artois was something of a free agent who took instructions from his brothers under advisement, but rarely as direct commands, and often was pursuing sort of his own agenda to promote the family as he saw best.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, obviously, Napoleon takes over in 1799. Depending on who I ask, who do you think was involved in some of these assassination plots against Napoleon? Obviously, the famous one, the gunpowder, infernal machine plot. Was it the Royalists? Was it, Comte d'Artois? Was it the British agents? Like, who was plotting these assassination attempts?
I mean, lots of people were. The Jacobins and the Royalists were both involved in some of these various plots. How involved Artois was is a little hard to pin down. Certainly, if you go up the ladder enough chains, all these Royalist conspiracies pretty much came back to him. He was in England for a lot of the Napoleonic regimes, much closer to the scene than Louis XVIII, who was in Germany or Russia for a lot of this time, was sort of much more out of things. Artois was sort of on the scene and much more actively collaborating, was tied up to all these networks of Royalist conspirators in France, some of whom were merely spying or trying to influence opinion, but others who were actively involved in what I call direct action. And how much, Charles was giving direct orders to people, or how much just saying, like, go help out my cause against the usurper, and leaving it up to the conspirators to decide what they wanted to do is hard to say. I don't think he would have been upset if a Royalist had managed to kill the usurper, Napoleon. And it's certainly not implausible that he talked to one of these people and told him to go do your best to kill him. Charles was an inveterate conspirator. He was enmeshed in a world of plotting up until the very end. And I think I'll talk about that a little bit later, about this sort of conspiratorial mindset and how that's contributed to his downfall. But some of that was shaped during his long exile, when that's basically all he had to do was plot. He had no armies. He could not use the conventional tools of statecraft to try to get what he wanted. All he had was the world of skullduggery and plots and conspiracies and assassinations.
Yeah, and you wonder during that time, and we'll get to post 1830 as well, did he go back to his old ways? Like, oh man, how do I get my throne back? But we'll get into that.
The other thing I should mention, we talked about his wife and their relatively distant relationship. They separated basically during the Revolution and never reunited. Charles had no interest really in reuniting. I believe there was a request that she could join him, and he said basically no. He also had a long-term mistress, Louise de Palestron, who he was with for many, many years, devoted to her. And she died while they were in exile in England. And the story goes that on her deathbed, she demanded that he promised to devote himself only to God after she was gone. And whether that actually happened or just a just so story, about this time, Charles X, the youthful playboy, did become devoutly religious, a devoutly religious Catholic, and would remain devoutly religious through to the end of his life.
That's interesting. Yeah, maybe he had an awakening, or maybe he just wanted to keep his promise. I mean, Napoleon had Marie Valeska. He had a mistress that he was very infatuated with. So maybe Charles X was similarly infatuated with this person and wanted to honor her in that way.
A lot of these old aristocrats, they had their formal marriages, which often were cold and people separated relatively young in life. Often the people get married, they would have the heir, maybe a second child, and then they just separate and go have their own affairs, both husband and wife. Not uncommon at all.
Yeah. Well, not to jump too far ahead in the story, but I'm trying to get to the reign of Charles X, and we still have some background to lay. He returns to France during the Bourbon Restoration, 1814, and supported his brother Louis XVIII. Do you think King Louis XVIII and his brother, the future Charles X, were trying to restore stability to France or turn back the clock on the revolution?
Both. Louis XVIII is just a really fascinating figure who went through a lot of twists and turns in his life. That he was something of a reformer before 1789. After going to exile, he went hard to the right and became sort of an uncompromising reactionary, demanding the complete and full restoration of the old ways. But gradually, over the long exile, Louis XVIII, bit by bit, would moderate and come to recognize that we have to make some concessions. We can't continue to demand everything goes back the way it was, which also ended up being convenient when he finally took power and inherited the administrative state that Napoleon had built, and discovered that a lot of this was actually very nice for the person at the top, and that he didn't want to get rid of the Council of State and the prefects and the disciplined army and all that. So Louis XVIII, under pressure from the Allies, issued a constitution for France, the Charter of 1814, which, while framed as a free gift that could implicitly be revoked at any time, still did sort of create a sort of semi-constitutional form of government for France. And even though Louis XVIII was sort of pressured into it, and other people wrote it, and he just sort of signed off on it, he did come to genuinely sort of view the charter as his child. There's a famous quote that he gave telling, via an intermediary, the King of Naples, that it was better to issue a constitution than to have one forced on you. And besides, it was the spirit of the age, which I think sums up Louis XVIII's attitude fairly well. Left to his own devices, he absolutely would have brought back the Ancien regime of his youth in all its pleasure and grandeur. But he recognized that times had changed and that there were certain things he had to compromise on if he wanted to keep the other aspects of the old order that he wanted. Charles X was never quite so open to these changes. By this time, he had acknowledged that some things had changed. You couldn't or didn't want to undo literally everything and turn the clock all the way back to 1789. But Charles X was much less in tune with the spirit of the age that his brother had made his peace with. Throughout Louis XVIII's reign, the Comte d'Artois was the leader of the right-wing faction, the so-called ultra-royalists, or the pures, or the pointus, the sort of the pointed ones. Sometimes he kept at a little distance because he was obliged to formally support his brother, but it was an open secret that Artois was the spiritual and social center of this hard-right faction, and sometimes engaged in active participation in politics, much to his brother's frequent frustration, especially earlier in Louis XVIII's reign. Near the end, as Louis XVIII's health started to fail, the political situation in France had changed. Louis XVIII had moved to the right a little bit, and also simultaneously gave Charles a larger role in the governance of France. One wag said something to the effect of, poor Louis XVIII will gets to see his brother as king before he even dies because of Artois' larger role. Although Louis XVIII was an ornery fellow who remained stubborn to the end when he wanted to be involved in something. But, Artois was well known as a hard right leader. This was not, this had some things that can be surprising to some people. For a lot of this period, the ultra-royalists were actually opposed to censorship partly because it was felt the ultra-royalists had better writers than some of these other factions, and some of these ministries that Louis XVIII had were more moderate, and censorship might have been used against the ultra-royalists. So Charles, was sort of anti-censorship in this period, and one of the first things he did upon becoming king was end of the censorship that had been currently in place.
You look at it, and you look at some of the mistakes they made along the way, and we're going to get to more of those here in a minute. Obviously, the killing of Marshal Ney by a firing squad was one. And I think if you're too strict and you try to stamp things out too much, like they were trying to avoid Bonapartism for forever. And then sure enough, in 1848, Napoleon's nephew comes back on the throne. So it's almost like perhaps they were too harsh in their measures. And if they were just gone a more moderate path, things would have turned out differently.
In 1824, France was fairly stable politically. The Restoration was fairly entrenched. There were still deeper currents moving. No country in Europe would end up immune to the demands for wider suffrage and the demands for sort of what we call social reform, for efforts to help workers who were impoverished as the Industrial Revolution transformed the continent. Those would have come to France regardless. But the Bourbon Restoration in the middle of the 80s was fairly stable and secure. It had survived a number of crises, some near-death experiences, an arguable death experience in 1815, but it had come through and was on relatively stable footing. This included some fairly repressive laws. It's often said that even at its worst, the Bourbon Restoration was less of a police state than France had been under Napoleon.
Okay.
Especially if you were a member of the elite. Under the Bourbon Restoration, there was a parliament where discourse was relatively free. A wider range of voices could express themselves publicly and argue than had been allowed under Napoleon. But, this was still a fairly, we would today call this a managed constitutional monarchy. There's heavy vote rigging. Secret police were ubiquitous. The king meddled in public affairs. So it was not what we would call a free and democratic state, but compared to what had been in the past and what people in Europe could experience by traveling to Austria or Prussia at the time, France was more free. And arguably at some points, you could argue at some point that Restoration France was more free than Britain at some point in certain aspects. This is a period of the Peterloo Massacre and all sorts of repression against left-wing activists in Britain as well.
Okay. So I'm just going to try and figure out in the 6 years here where it starts to unravel. We'll start at the beginning. Charles X becomes King of France in 1824. His brother Louis XVIII dies, and he promotes traditional Catholic values, aristocratic privileges, earning support from conservatives and hostility from liberals. Looking back on it, is this a bad idea?
So Charles X has a bit of a honeymoon phase after he takes over. Like, everybody knows that he's far to the right. This is an open secret in France. But he comes in, he makes these goodwill gestures, he lifts censorship, he frees a bunch of political prisoners, he does sort of a charm offensive, and things go pretty well. But over sort of his first year in office, I think the turning point is often seen as Charles's official coronation in May 1825, the city of France, in the cathedral there. That's sort of seen as sort of the end of the honeymoon and the beginning of this new phase. His government, led by the Comte de Villèle, who he inherited from Louis XVIII, passes several controversial laws, the so-called Émigrés Billion, which compensated nobles who'd lost land during the Restoration. Ironically, a lot of historians, it was deeply unpopular, as it would be today, like using taxpayer money to reward a bunch of rich and famous people. It was never going to be politically a good idea in the short term. A lot of historians do see it as probably a good policy, because the emigres who had their land seized were ceaselessly agitating and stirring things up to try to get their land back. And what they wanted was the state to seize their land from the people who had bought it and give it back to them. Yeah. Or to pressure the people who bought it using social pressure at the local level, pressure them to sell it back. And the mere possibility that it's like 10% of France, of French people, owned some of the seized land. This was not a small amount of resources. The existence of this was a huge source of instability, and the opposition played this up that, you have to support us or the Bourbons are going to retake the biens nationaux, the seized land, the national goods. And by paying off the émigrés, this agitation largely stopped. the value of this seized land went up after the Emigres Billion was passed because the title to it was seen as more secure. So it was probably a good policy, but it was absolutely a self-inflicted political wound. There's also a blasphemy law that was passed. There had been a couple of high-profile vandalizations of Catholic churches. And then you get to this 1825, the coronation ceremony of Charles X, which by and large follows the millennia-old traditions of French royal coronations.
Sure.
There are some compromises, some updates. Some of the French marshals participate in the ceremony. The king included an oath to uphold the charter, which Louis XIV and XVI had never done. But it was held in the Catholic Church. There was bishops involved. It was a religious ceremony. In France, there was this baptismal oil that had supposedly been brought down by heaven for, I think, the baptism of Clovis in more than a millennia ago. And this had been destroyed during the Revolution, but supposedly it was rediscovered days before the coronation. That supposedly a loyal devotee had saved some of this from destruction and kept it secret, and it came out at the exact time. This was amazing. France can continue this tradition because there's been a miracle and this has been saved. To everyone else, all this smacked of the old ways of religious devotion, and it was deeply unpopular and cemented the image of Charles X, combined with things like the Emigres Billion and the sacrilege law, cemented the image of Charles X as this backwards figure. Widespread conspiracy theories at this time from the left and even up to the center right about the role of the Jesuits, famous target throughout the centuries for conspiracy theories, and the so-called Congregation, which was widely seen as this right-wing Catholic secret society that had its tendrils everywhere in society and was plotting to manipulate France. And it was widely believed that Charles was either a member of this group or a puppet of this group at the time.
Well, he also gets involved in foreign policy, notably the colonization of Algeria by France. Is this just a distraction for the public to kind of put their focus on, or is he trying to rebuild the glory of France?
Both. Charles was active in foreign policy he was not a mere figurehead as king. He was at active powers in much of Europe, which ruled by monarchs, and monarchs would write to each other. That was normal. That would continue under the July monarchy, much to the frustration of Louis Philippe's ministers. Charles and his advisors, like Jules de Polignac, who we'll have time to talk about coming up, pursued lots of schemes to try to boost French national greatness. Polignac at one point proposed this elaborate, fantastical scheme involving redrawing the map of Europe, where Russia would get lands from the Ottoman Empire, and Austria would get lands from the Ottoman Empire, and then Prussia would get other lands, and then there's all of the swap. France would get some of the territory that had been forced to surrender after Napoleon's downfall, sort of reclaiming the natural borders of France that were such an obsession across the political spectrum at the time. This went nowhere. None of the other countries in Europe wanted any part of this. But Charles was genuinely interested in this. But the particular circumstances of the invasion of Algiers, the modern-day capital city of Algeria, happened, there was some particular inspirations involved. There had been a long-standing dispute over some unpaid debts. The French envoy had been swatted by a fly swatter by the leader of Algiers. But the particular circumstances was that in August 1829, Charles X had, for the past year or two, been forced basically to accept a more moderate ministry than he wanted. All the efforts of censorship and vote rigging had failed in 1827. France's very tiny electorate, about 1% of adult males had the right to vote, which was determined based on wealth at the time. France's tiny electorate had defeated ultra-royalist candidates, forced out the Comte de Villèle, Joseph de Villèle, the fairly competent prime minister under Louis and Charles. Charles had been forced to accept a more moderate ministry under Vicomte de Martignac and hated it. Absolutely hated all these concessions. Every day he was asked to make a new concession, a new compromise, and occasionally he liked some of them, but the culminating impact of all these concessions he was asked to make just chafed on him. And in August 1829, he fired Martignac and replaced him with a new ministry led by his old friend Jules de Polignac. Back to the Versailles days, just as Catholic and conservative as Charles was, and a ministry made up entirely of far-right people, which is mostly due to what Charles wanted, but also because anyone who wasn't far-right generally declined to be involved when they were asked.
Yeah, and that's part of my next question. I always wondered this about failed kings and emperors and despots. Did they just have bad advisors, or did they have good advisors and just ignore them?
Here's my 30-second story with Guinness. As soon as my sister and I get home for the holidays, we don't even unpack. We head straight to our pub. The bartender already knows our order, Guinness and fries. We laugh all night, catch up with old friends, and walk home with faces sore from smiling. It's one of my favorite nights of the year. That was my 30-second story with Guinness.
Guinness Draft Stout. Please enjoy responsibly. Imported by Diageo Beer Company, USA, New York, New York.
Hello, I'm Diane Morgan. If you know who I am, you know who I am. If you don't, who cares? I'm here to explain Italian Time, a holiday phenomenon where Italians throw away their clocks and gather for eternity with San Pellegrino. I've been at this party so long that I've eaten 5 courses, hugged someone's grandma twice, and been offered a job in the family restaurant. So this holiday season, make sure to bring enough San Pellegrino to last you through the meal, the after meal, and the entire goodbye ritual. San Pellegrino, holiday on Italian Time.
I mean, certainly some of Charles's advisors over the years were bad. Probably none worse than Jules de Polignac, who had some talents, but you can't conclude anything other than that Jules de Polignac was a disastrous choice of prime minister for Charles. But he also had capable leaders. Joseph de Villèle was a fairly competent administrator, although he ended up alienating a lot of people by the end. Martignac served ably, and Martignac was an ultra royalist, but one who was pragmatic and thought that there were certain concessions that had to be made in order to preserve the crown. And there were other people who were close to Charles, part of his court circle and stuff like that, who had more moderate positions and were sending him letters and messages trying to urge him to take more moderate courses. And ultimately, it comes down to what Charles wanted. He chose who he would listen to and who he wouldn't listen to. And by the end, what he wanted to listen to was far-right figures like Jules de Polignac, who would take an uncompromising attitude toward France's liberal opposition, and the reforms and the changes that they were demanding, which Charles felt were offensive to his dignity as monarch, and which he felt were a slippery slope to a new revolution. Is one of the defining memories he took out of 1789. He saw what the catastrophic mistake that triggered everything was when Louis XVI had agreed under pressure to fire his prime minister and bring back Jacques Necker. And Charles saw that as the big mistake and was determined to not back down and not let the mob pressure him into firing his ministers. And he would continue to devoutly believe this right up until he was being chased out of France.
Yeah, well, let's get into it. In July 1830, he issues the July Ordinances, they're called, which suspended press freedom, dissolved parliament, and led to public outrage. I know you and I have gone into this subject on our Marche Marmont episode, but why wasn't Charles able to put down this particular revolution?
So let's zoom back a little bit. France had been sort of in a slow-moving political crisis from the moment Charles appointed the Polignac ministry, or what became the Polignac ministry. The Chamber of Deputies in early 1830 had made a provocative declaration. Well, Charles had made a speech to the chambers in which he had insisted on the rights of his throne, and the Chamber of Deputies had then voted a response to this speech in which they basically called for Charles to fire Polignac. Charles dissolved Parliament. There are new elections. And why did Charles think that he would be able to win this new round of elections when all the past elections have been going badly? Well, one thing he did was take a more active role. Charles penned an active appeal to voters to support ultra-royalist candidates. Previously, kings had kept a little bit of a sort of fictitious neutrality in all this, even though everybody knew that the kings had their political preferences. Charles broke that and got himself directly involved in politics, which sort of undermined some of the mystique around him and was probably a mistake. But the other thing he did was try to stir up nationalist sentiment in favor of his ministers with a successful foreign invasion. And he took advantage of these provocations that had been building up with Algiers to send a large expedition to do something to the leader of Algiers. It was not quite clear what exactly that would entail, maybe just like a punitive expedition to force some concessions, as it ultimately ended up being a conquest. And this expedition just ended up coming off fairly successfully. The French army occupied the city of Algiers without too much trouble, but Charles didn't get the credit for it. people were like, yay France, rather than yay Charles. And the electors went out and they voted an even larger liberal majority. And at this point, Charles and his ministers decided, we can't do this electorally. They thought, there were these conspirators on the left who were stage managing events. The liberal press was, as they saw it, printing all sorts of falsehoods and lies and calumnies. And they generally thought that they needed a reset. They needed to get France right on the right track. So they passed these 4 ordinances, which dissolved Parliament before the newly elected Parliament, before it even had a chance to meet. It imposed widespread press censorship, having taken the lessons of past attempts at censorship to try to close all the loopholes that newspapers had used to dodge the press censorship. And it unilaterally rewrote election laws to skew the elections even more in favor of far-right candidates, which is how they thought that this new round of elections would go better for them than all the last couple of rounds of elections. They adopted this on Sunday, July 25th. It was published on Monday, July 26th. And on Tuesday, July 27th, everything exploded gradually. Lots of people in France had expected Charles to try a coup. It was just like not a complete surprise. Royalist newspapers had been urging Charles to do a coup for a long time. Opposition newspapers had been challenging this. People in the middle were like, oh, you're talking coup again? It was a boy cries wolf situation. He's never going to actually do it. He's never actually going to have the guts to seize power. And then he did with the 4 ordinances in July 1830, widely seen as a bad move.
Yeah, and we talked about our Marshal Marmont episode. So basically this powder keg blows up, and although Marmont has about 10,000 troops, that's really not enough to put down this huge, I wouldn't call it a citywide, but it's a large revolution in Paris.
Yeah, much of central Paris also ends up consumed by this revolution. For what begins as protests, then becomes riots, and then becomes an insurgency, and gradually grows and grows until the Royal Army is being chased out of Paris with its tail between its legs. And a lot of people have wondered, like, how could Charles and Polignac have been so stupid as to leave only about 10,000 effective troops in Paris at the time when they're launching a royal coup? There were like 3 times as many troops in Paris in July 1789 when the Bastille fell. And that had been an inadequate number of troops.
Right.
Decades later, when Napoleon III launches his coup, he will move with clockwork military efficiency to blanket the streets of Paris with soldiers, arrest all the opposition preemptively, suppress any chance for anything to go wrong. None of that happens in 1830. The announcement ordinances are published, and then people start making, okay, we should probably start arresting some of these critics, and everything moves very slowly and languorously. And my theory, I can't say this is like absolute hard fact, but I think it's a strong interpretation of the available data, that the reason why Charles and Polignac didn't have more on hand, well, we know that a reason was they didn't want to tip themselves off. They thought if they started concentrating troops in Paris, it would tip everyone off that a coup was coming. That much we know.
Right.
I think it goes back to the Charles and Polignac's decades of life in this shadowy underworld of conspiracies and plots. They saw the world through a conspiratorial mindset. And they believed, this is also true, that there was the so-called faction, that the left opposition was a centrally directed conspiracy by the so-called comité directeur, the directorial committee or managing committee. My theory is that they thought that their opposition to the reign wasn't organic, and that all they had to do was take the comité directeur by surprise, and they wouldn't be able to arrange any response. Because even afterwards in the memoirs, there are all these attempts by Charles's former ministers to say, oh, well, the bourgeois factory owners were paying their workers to go out into the streets. This was all directed. This was planned. This was a plot. None of this this is all spontaneous. Charles pissed off the printers, and the printers went off and stirred up trouble. But these people seriously believe this was all stage managed, and I think that explains why they didn't take more preparations, because they thought, if we don't give these guys a chance to plot, then there won't be any response and everything will be quiet.
I think your episode where you mentioned even the first night of the revolution, Charles is doing his usual thing, playing cards with his buddies. He doesn't think it's a big deal.
Yeah. Charles is off in Saint-Cloud, so he's not on the ground, and he's being informed mostly by Polignac, who's sending him regular dispatches and telling him to not listen to anybody else except him. And Polignac is just blithely convinced that everything's going to turn out okay, long after things are not okay anymore. After Marmont was telling him we're in trouble, after other ministers like the naval minister Baron de Haussay, who's just like incredulous as to how incompetent Polignac is, he's saying like, dude, you got to do something. Polignac just like refuses to make any compromises, even like tactical compromises where you pretend to make a concession that you'll plan on going back on later. None of this happens. And finally, the compromise, Charles starts making compromises way too late.
Yeah, a day late and a dollar short.
Every concession he makes is a day late and a dollar short. The army is on the verge of losing Paris, and he finally says, okay, I can make some minor concessions. And these are concessions that, like, 3 days ago, the opposition would have said, great, this is amazing. You're going to fire Polignac and repeal the 4 ordinances. That's all we wanted. But by this time, that was no longer enough. They wanted more. They couldn't trust Charles anymore. They needed more stuff. The people of Paris weren't going to lay down their arms for that. So Charles would dig in his heels, and he would refuse, and there would be a long argument. And finally, he'd agree to make another concession. Yeah. Okay, I'll appoint a more moderate prime minister. And again, this would have been more than enough a couple days ago, but now it was too late. And this happened again and again and again.
Yeah. Yeah, well, he's finally deposed in 1830 during the July Revolution. He's forced to abdicate. The crown passes to Louis Philippe. Must have been very difficult to get booted out of your home country on 3 different occasions. French Revolution, 100 Days, and now this.
I imagine it gets a little easier with each subsequent exile. You're not caught by surprise anymore.
Right. He's like, I know how to flee. Yeah.
Also, I will note that Louis XVIII, having gone through the same double exile, insisted on keeping money in a British bank in case he ever had to go into exile again, so he would have money on hand and wouldn't be dependent on handouts.
Smart. Well, did Charles X ever attempt to regain his throne? Like, what were his later years like in exile?
Yeah, Charles went to England first in exile, eventually went to Austria. It was this weird ambiguity there where, like, Charles X had abdicated in favor not of his son, the Duc d'Angoulême, but of his grandson, Henry, who was seen as more of a political innocent, who wasn't tarred by the calamitous decisions of the 4 ordinances. But for the remainder of his life, it was sort of a gray zone as to who was really in charge in this exile court. Charles was basically still running things, even though his underage son was heir. And it was not clear, like, it was as if Charles was acting as a regent. But, like, people who visited and were too obsequious about praising young Henry as my king would get, like, this real cold shoulder. There's this real ambiguity that Charles did not want punctured as to, like, who was actually king at the time. Henry, for his part, saw his grandfather as king. I insisted his grandfather was the rightful king of France until his death. But there were royalist attempts to reclaim power, none more dramatic than that led by Charles's daughter-in-law, the Duchesse de Berry, the widow of the assassinated Duc de Berry, who made a landing in France and tried to stir up a rebellion that absolutely fizzled. She ended up going to hiding in France for quite some time, was finally betrayed and tracked down, where it was discovered then that she had a second secret marriage and was pregnant, which for traditionalist Catholics as well as for someone whose authority came entirely from her first marriage to Charles' son, really just like blew everything up. And that failed. There were continued plots and schemes, but nothing serious.
Right.
The real danger after this to the July monarchy came from the left, from Republican plotters and uprisings. Charles, you sort of maintained his court in exile. You focused on educating his son, getting offended at slights from foreign leaders who he thought wanted to treat him with royal dignity and who saw him as a real screw-up who'd hurt the cause of royal legitimacy for all of Europe. And ultimately, he died a sad death of disease in exile.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. Spends the rest of his life in exile, dies in 1836 in Austria. Oddly, he's the only French king who's not buried in France. What do you think his legacy is?
I mean, it's not good. even if you put yourself in the position of a devoted legitimist, someone who's convinced that he was the rightful king of France, ordained by God and man, and remained so until his death. Even if you put yourself in this position, he made a lot of blunders. Even if you're in the position that the only mistake he made was not enforcing his 4 ordinances more vigorously, this still, like, he's the guy who made the blunder and tried a coup without having the soldiers on hand to back it up. And whether you think that was his mistake, or whether you think his mistake was not being willing to compromise more, or whether you think all this was a mistake and you're not a legitimist at all, there's no way in which you can view him as a successful ruler of France. Whether it was by being too hard or not hard enough, he didn't get it right. Which is why you see a lot of the legitimist sort of clung to this idea that there was been a conspiracy. The real actors in this had been the opposition conspiracy that had been laying these plots in motion. And that it's not like, the ostensible leaders of the conspiracy, like Lafayette, were off at their country homes when this broke out. Many of the other prominent liberal leaders spent the first few days of the revolution trying desperately to save Charles's throne for him. And again, he refused to make these small compromises that might have done it at the time.
Well, that's what it strikes me as. It's a huge failed opportunity. Obviously, you're an educated man. You grew up in Versailles. You have the best teachers in the world. You see where your brother Louis XVI failed. You see where your brother Louis XVIII failed. You notice that Napoleon's system of government is a good one. So you have all these things to learn from, and you still screwed up.
The July Revolution 1830 was an entirely self-inflicted wound. Whether Charles would have eventually run into a popular revolution driven by a refusal to expand the franchise, to let more people vote, by the economic dislocations that were starting to hit Europe at this time, is entirely possible. Like more moderate regimes like the July monarchy ultimately fell to these sort of pressures. Like, would Charles have found a way to thread the circle? There were some ultra-royalists who had the idea that we should let poor people vote because the real enemy is the middle class. And if we let the poor people vote, then they'll vote for us. They'll vote for the king against the middle class, which I'm not sure how well that would have played out for them in the end. But in the short term, that might have actually worked. It's possible that Charles might have come around to something like that, or maybe he would have, like the younger Charles, fought reform tooth and nail to the very end and ultimately fall into another revolution that wasn't self-inflicted. Who knows? But he didn't need to fall in July 1830. That was all on him.
No, and I think part of that legacy, there's obviously no clamor to get his buried remains back to France. Even Napoleon in 1840, there was a push to get him back in France. Maybe there is here and there to get him reburied in France, but clearly he didn't do a very good job if there's no clamor for it.
Yeah, some people, there were some diehard loyalists to Charles during his years of exile, and a very tiny faction who were supporters of Charles's son, the Duc d'Angoulême. But most of the French legitimists put all their emotional devotion onto Henry, the grandson, and he became the locus of legitimism. He was free from the follies and the blunders of July 1830. He was someone that the legitimists could pin their hopes into. And eventually he grew up to be an adult and made his own blunders, but that's a story for another day. There were not a lot of diehard Charles defenders after the fact.
Well, amazing overview as always, David. Yeah, that was just great stuff. I knew a little bit about Charles X, but I'm really glad you kind of opened the box on him and let us learn about him. That was really good stuff.
Thank you. I've covered Charles extensively for the whole range of my podcast. Episode 26, I sort of recover the whole events of the Restoration from Charles's perspective. I put him on the throne in episode 28, and then cover the events of the July Revolution in great detail, starting with episode 39 all the way through to episode 45.
Yeah, again, if you want to learn more about Charles X or the political background of France at this time, please check out the Siècle with David Montgomery, and we thank him for his time.
Thanks for having me on.
Always a pleasure.
Hey, Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. One of the perks about having 4 kids that you know about is actually getting a direct line to the big man up north. Mm-hmm. And this year, he wants you to know the best gift that you can give someone is the gift of Mint Mobile's unlimited wireless for $15 a month. Now, you don't even need to wrap it. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Pleasure. Thank you, David.